high-flying, hard-hitting, total entertainment excitement. It's Showtime in March and April. Entertainment that begins with blockbusters. There's a cop.
It's difficult to imagine anything more conservative than the choice reached by the Soviet Politburo and confirmed unanimously today by the Soviet Communist Party's Central Committee. They picked an older man who has never distinguished himself by publicly proposing a new idea. Konstantin Chernenko is the new Soviet Party leader. Here's how the announcement was made on Moscow television. Our correspondent in London, Jack Lawrence, follows up.
Today's announcement on Russian radio and TV that Konstantin Chernenko has been chosen the new General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party is no surprise. The 72-year-old party ideologue was a leading candidate for the job the last time it became vacant, with the death of Leonid Brezhnev 16 months ago. But he lost the struggle for succession to his rival, Yuri Andropov. Now, Chernenko has proved his powers as a survivor in a party dominated by cautious, conservative, and elderly survivors. But like Andropov, Chernenko's health is less than hearty, and he may not live long enough to make his mark on the Soviet leadership.
The Secretary General takes a few years to build up a really strong power base and bring in his own supporters. So if Gorbachev had got the job, the youngest man, it would have mattered a great deal. Chernenko simply doesn't have the time, I think, to put his own individual stamp on the Soviet system. And as far as foreign policy is concerned, Gromyko will probably be more influential, if anything, than Chernenko. He certainly knows much more about international affairs than Chernenko does.
In 1950, Chernenko attracted the attention of the regional party leader, Leonid Brezhnev, and began an association that took them both to Moscow and the corridors of supreme power in the Soviet Union. Chernenko served as Brezhnev's chief of staff for 17 years and rode his coattails to membership of the Politburo. A former American ambassador to Moscow says of him, Chernenko is a faceless apparatchik. He has never put his stamp on anything. Another diplomat called him a faceless bureaucrat. In the Kremlin, Chernenko established a reputation for political orthodoxy. He produced books and articles on ideological affairs. He never ran a farm or a factory, never commanded a military unit, never headed a ministry, and has no major experience in economic, industrial, or agricultural affairs. He is said to have little experience in foreign affairs. A Soviet official says, Chernenko is known as a man whose instinct is to say no to innovation and to oppose anything that smacks to him of liberalism. In recent years, Chernenko launched an ideological offensive against Western influences in Soviet culture, warning of contamination from what he called decadent Western art. He urged party officials to learn the lessons of Poland and issued a scathing attack on complacency in Soviet trade unions. A Western diplomat says, he symbolizes a system frightened of change. Chernenko went with Brezhnev in 1979 to the signing of the SALT II arms limitation treaty with the United States. The question Western diplomats are asking today is, will party chairman Chernenko send Russian negotiators back to the bargaining tables at Geneva? Whatever decisions emerge from the men in the Kremlin and their new party leader Chernenko, most observers believe they will be made collectively, by committee, and they will be made in the greatest secrecy. As Winston Churchill said of decision-making in the Kremlin, it is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. John Lawrence for Nightline in London.
In a moment, we'll be joined live from Moscow by one of the Kremlin's top advisors on American affairs. We'll also talk to a former White House advisor on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe.
Beirut is in a state of inner siege. Once again, this important city is divided by civil war. Tomorrow from West Beirut, a Richard Threlkell status report. What's happening now? What hope does the future hold for a troubled Lebanese people?
Tomorrow on ABC's World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Stanislav Menshikov is a consultant to the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party on American Affairs. That means it's his job to interpret developments in the United States and U.S. response to developments in the Soviet Union for the highest levels of the Soviet leadership. Mr. Menshikov is with us now live via satellite from Moscow. I realize this is the opposite of your normal job, but will you help us understand a little about what's going on in your capital today? Does this represent change or continuity?
This represents continuity at this moment, and it also represents change because our country is in change all the time, both economically and politically. This is evolution, and this is progress. Progress is change.
Now, I realize, Mr. Menshikov, we also have a 73-year-old president, so we have learned to grow accustomed to the wisdom of older leadership. But it seems to me that by electing a 72-year-old man, the Politburo has said that it does not want to make any radical change. Would you agree with that interpretation?
The Politburo did the most natural thing to do. It elected the man who has been chairing the Central Committee for a number of years in the absence of Mr. Brezhnev when he was absent, or in the absence of Mr. Andropov when he was sick. And though Mr. Andropov was actively working, Mr. Chernenko has been the active head of the Central Committee for the last few months and even years, at least. So he has all the experience necessary to carry this job on. And it is a most logical change. You don't change horses, as they say, in the middle of a successful policy, a successful race.
Well, you know what some of our experts have been saying, because it's your job to know what our experts are saying.
Yeah,
and they claim that Mr. Chernenko would have logically been a successor to Mr. Brezhnev, but that he and Mr. Andropov were in fact rivals. So it almost seems as though you're moving back a little more toward the Brezhnev era.
This is not correct, because both Mr. Andropov and Mr. Chernenko have been actively managing the affairs of the Central Committee before Mr. Brezhnev's death. And as those experts would recall, Mr. Andropov came back to the Central Committee as a secretary of the Central Committee early in 1982. And since that time, he was managing the affairs together with Mr. Chernenko. So it was very logical, and he was brought back for that particular reason, as any expert would readily understand.
Mr. Menshikov, I don't know if you could hear our report from London, but one of the British experts that was interviewed described Mr. Chernenko as a faceless bureaucrat. Would you sketch in a few of the features for us? I'm sure he's not faceless to you.
Well, he's been, this is a man who was born in Siberia. Siberians have a very particularly interesting character. They're very innovative. They're very energetic, good manager, good organizers. I don't see this man as in those terms that have been described by this gentleman from London. As we see him, he has... what do you think, the other members of the Politburo? Would they choose such a man? Why should they do this? This is absolutely inconceivable.
Well, you ask the question. Let me theorize an answer for you. If indeed they wanted to maintain a certain level of their own control, and if they couldn't decide on someone who represents a big leap forward in another direction, this would be a safe transitional move to make, would it not?
Well, the policies, our policies, both internally and externally, were set in the last year and a half under Mr. Andropov's leadership. Mr. Chernenko is to pursue these policies, which have been set up collectively with Mr. Chernenko, with Mr. Gorbachev, with Mr. Gromyko, with Mr. Ustinov, with all the other members of the Politburo. Why should they change the team, the members of the team that have been pursuing this policy?
Right.
In the course of 2 years, you know, if this was 20 years, 30 years, I could understand, but we're talking about a period of 1 year. The policy has been set. Mr. Chernenko has made it quite clear in his acceptance speech that he's pursuing the policy that have been set by the Central Committee after Mr. Brezhnev's death and under Mr. Andropov. So it is absolutely logical as a choice.
That may prove to be very bad news for U.S.-Soviet relations, because things have never been cooler than they've been over the past couple of years. Are you suggesting that's the way it's going to be?
That's putting the blame on that on Mr. Andropov. But if you look at what happened before he came to the leadership of the Central Committee, you will see that the relations were not much better. And the reason for that, they lie with Mr. Reagan. As you remember, we have suggested a direct dialogue, even on a summit at the beginning of 1981 when Mr. Reagan became the President of the United States. This was suggested by Mr. Brezhnev himself at the 26th Congress of the party. And we never had that.
Mr. Benjamin, forgive me for interrupting you. As an expert on American affairs, you know that we have to break for commercials, and we're going to do that right now if you'll be good enough to stand by. When we return, we'll continue our discussion with Stanislav Menshikov live from Moscow, and we'll be joined by Richard Pipes, an American expert on the White House National Security Council. When your day begins... Richard Pipes, professor of history at Harvard University now, is former director of East European and Soviet affairs for the National Security Council here in Washington. That made him President Reagan's top advisor on the Soviet Union. Mr. Pipes joins us live now from our Boston bureau. Any new insights on the ascension of Mr. Chernenko?
I don't think I have any new insights. I tend to go with the American consensus that he is essentially a compromised transitional candidate, because the real battle for leadership is still ahead and is going to take quite a long time.
Is that a battle that's likely to go underway even now, even as we sit through this transition?
Oh, very likely. It probably has been underway ever since it became clear that Andropov is very ill. I think the transfer of Romanov from Leningrad to Moscow, to the Secretariat last June, was a signal that, in fact, he was being groomed by one faction for the successorship.
Now, you heard what Mr. Menshikov had to say. He says essentially it just indicates they've got themselves a good team and you don't change horses in midstream, as he put it.
Well, but they've got a dozen horses, and they could have picked another horse. This obviously is a very experienced man, and he is a good servant of the party. I must say that he is not quite as faceless and conservative as he's reputed to be. I was struck when I was in the White House by some of his statements on Poland. Of all the Politburo members, he seems to have understood best that what happened in Poland could not be handled by mere repression. And he was very worried, apparently, about the collapse of the party, about the loss of contact between the party and the workers and the people at large, and advocated in Russia a number of measures, modest to be sure, which nevertheless suggested that he had some grasp of what was occurring and what was ailing Russia.
Chernenko was also closely associated, was he not, with Leonid Brezhnev's moves toward détente. Does that suggest in any way that we might move back into that era, or is that impossible now?
Well, in my opinion, the real problems facing the Soviet leadership are internal and not foreign. And the real battle for succession will take place between what we may call the old guard, consisting essentially of military personnel, security personnel, and the more conservative elements of the party who want the status quo, and the economic managers and the somehow more perceptive, intelligent party people who would like internal reform. Internal reform has a logic in it, and it requires an attenuation of foreign aggression, less militarism, better relations with the West.
Mr. Menshikov, you might rephrase that, but would you agree with the essential thrust of it, that the Soviet Union's problems at the moment are essentially domestic problems rather than outer directed?
We have both. We have economic problems. Mr. Chernenko has stated what the problems are. We have been now for a year and a half been successfully increasing the rate of economic development. We want to keep it up at that level, and but for that purpose, of course, we have to have a peaceful situation in the world. We can't go on successfully developing our economy and at the same time spending a lot of money on on military hardware.
Well, that brings me to the present. Our Vice President George Bush is there right now. Our press is full of speculation that he's over there to propose a spring summit between, now it would be Mr. Chernenko and President Reagan. Is a summit a likely eventuality?
Well, I don't know what he has in his luggage. He'll have to show it before we can have an answer, and we have to read what it means. And a summit is a good thing. It has to be, as both sides have said, well prepared. But the main thing is, do the Americans, is the American side ready to talk with the with our side on the basis of equality and equal security. That's the main thing. By that means, and that's not just an enigma, but if you think of it as we are talking about equality in the military balance. We're not talking about superiority of either side. Superiority is suicide in this world. Equality, equality at a lower level. If the Americans are ready to look at these problems from that point, they'll find a good partner.
Dr. Pipes, given that...
Excuse me, as they did in the 70s when they were ready.
Yeah, given that definition of equality, and since I assume you know a little more, Dr. Pipes, about what's in Vice President Bush's baggage, as Mr. Menshikov puts it, what are the chances of a successful summit, or any summit at all?
Well, the chances of a summit are there, but whether they will be successful, whether the summit will be successful is dubious, because a summit can be a public relations exercise, and as such I don't consider it a very useful phenomenon, or it can be the culmination of a long process of negotiations, which is then sealed and finalized by the heads of state. I just don't see that in the next few months we will resolve any of the outstanding problems, which during the last 3 years we tried to raise with the Soviet side and almost never got positive answers, on regional problems especially. Therefore, a simple meeting between the two heads of state, I don't think will serve any purpose.
We literally only have 15 seconds left. Has the reality of the U.S.-Soviet relationship changed with Chernenko in there now?
No, I think we'll have to wait and see what happens. Mr. Chernenko's speech today was very standard fare and suggested no change in attitude or policy.
All right, Dr. Pipes, Mr. Menshikov, thank you both very much for joining us this evening. ABC News coverage of Yuri Andropov's funeral will begin this morning at 3:30 a.m. Eastern Time. In a moment, we'll...